Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. First of all, if you're new here, I post new book reviews almost every single day. So if you're looking for some reading inspiration, you want to know what other people are reading, you like following book reviews, then feel free to stick around. Now let's talk about today's book. Today I'm going to be reviewing Lighthouses of New England. This is what the cover looks like, and the text in this is by John Marcus, the photography by Susan Cole Kelly. So this book I got in advance of a trip I'm taking to New England, or the New England section of the United States. This is a section kind of in the upper northeast, and it's a region that I haven't visited in at least over a decade. So I got a number of books out of the library to read before I took my trip, so I would just have a better appreciation of the area that I was seeing and the area that I was visiting before I actually visited. And this was one of the books that I got in conjunction with all the other books that I got. And I got this because I do enjoy visiting lighthouses, and I do plan to see a couple on my trip. I, however, am more familiar with the lighthouses in what's known as the Great Lakes region of the United States, and or the United States and Canada. The Great Lakes border both the US and Canada. So I'm more familiar with the lighthouses in those areas. So I was interested in learning more about the lighthouses on the Atlantic coast and seeing how they differed, how they were the same, some of the history. Some of the things that I suspected would be that there was going to be some that were older, as lighthouses I would assume would be built sooner, built later, built earlier, that's the word I'm looking for, on the Atlantic coast than they were in the Great Lakes region, but I didn't really know what the differences would be, and I visited quite a number in the Great Lakes region, so I was just interested to see the difference. So this book is broken up into a number of sections. We have history, we have the building itself and how the lighthouse works. We have life in the lighthouse, we have legends like myths, stories, ghosts, pirates, all those things, everything that can be lumped in legends, and preservation efforts. So I found that some sections of this book I enjoyed more than others. I enjoyed the history, I really enjoyed the life in the lighthouse, and I enjoyed the legends section the most. The other stuff was interesting. I feel like the history section gave me the background I needed. The building and how they work was sort of interesting. I just felt like each lighthouse was a little unique in that regard, especially how it came about, how people decided to put a lighthouse there. That's kind of something that I felt like I needed to know on a lighthouse by lighthouse basis. So trying to cram it all into one section was kind of a lot. I liked that in the life in the lighthouse, they didn't just keep it high level, but they called out specific examples from lightkeepers and things that happened in their life. For example, people who lost children or lost relatives, or different thoughts and feelings and opinions that these lightkeepers had on their tasks. So I really liked that section because it wasn't just like they were responsible for this and they usually had trouble with this, but they called out specific examples, which I always like because I feel like it kind of brings history a little bit more to life when we're getting inside the heads of people who lived at that time and did this sort of work. So I thought that probably Life in the Lighthouse and the Legends section were the best or most well done, I should say. Another thing to note is that this book was written in 2001. Now, because a lot of the stuff referenced in the book is historical, so the actual history of lighthouses, how the lighthouse was built and how they functioned, and the life in the lighthouse and legends, all of that stuff I feel like isn't really affected as much by age. Now, maybe some more accurate information comes out, or maybe some more discoveries are learned about these lighthouses, but I feel like that part isn't really affected by the fact that this book is over 20 years old. You can still read all that section and enjoy it. The part that I feel like does get a little, or does age a little bit, is the preservation. Now the preservation, like the history of the preservation, what groups came together to save what lights, what groups were currently managing with lights, or the efforts that had to be done to move these lighthouses away from eroding shores, for example. All of that stuff I would still classify as like history, the history of how these lights were preserved and not just left to crumble in history. However, the current preservation status of some of these lights might be lacking, as a lot of things I'm assuming have changed in the last 20 years. So that is one area that I think if you're reading this book, maybe getting something more current or being a little bit more familiar with what's going on currently in the region would be helpful. However, if you're looking just for how these lighthouses came to be preserved, what societies or people did what to make sure that the lights were going to be available to people 20, 30, 50 years in the future, if you were just looking for that, then this book would be perfectly fine. I personally didn't really have a problem with the age of this book. It was just a lot of text about history coupled with excellent photography. So the age didn't really bother me, and I don't want to let the age dissuade you from getting this book out yourself. One thing that I found interesting or different between the lighthouses in the Great Lakes and the lighthouses in the Atlantic, on the Atlantic coast, and this is, I'm not a lighthouse expert, I'm not a historical expert, I literally just go to these little lighthouses that are free in the Great Lakes region, and you can see them free or a nominal fee to go into the little museums. So this may be wrong, but this is just a layperson's experience after reading this. And that is that these lighthouses on the Atlantic coast would sometimes be put on islands. Well, in my personal experience, a lot of the lights in the Great Lakes region are along the coast. So I feel like the people who were in these lighthouses in the Atlantic region, especially the ones on islands that were really far away from, or not far away, but physically separated from the mainland by water, I guess that's the definition of an island, how isolated they were and how much more isolated I feel like they were than the ones in the Great Lakes region. There was a whole section on page 94, if you do get this book out, called Madness and Loneliness. And there was quite a number of instances where people just couldn't take being separated from other people. There are mentions of children who just wanted to get off these islands, of wives who wound up living on the mainland while their husbands worked on the lights, of just the, as this title says, the loneliness of being trapped in an area that you can't physically leave or can't leave as easily. Now, I'm sure the people who were on the mainland also struggled with some of that, but I feel like that's more pronounced when you're physically kind of trapped on an island. And I feel like there are fewer of those sort of lights where you're out physically separated from the mainland by water in the Great Lakes region, which is the one I'm more familiar with. So it's going to be interesting to see. I'm excited to see these. I'm probably not going to look at a lot of the island lights just because a lot of them you need to get on a ferry to go over there. But I feel like that would be interesting for a return trip to go on a ferry to some of those islands and see some of those lighthouses. And I do think that was the difference that I noticed, is how much more it weighed on the lightkeepers to be physically separated from society, being stuck on these rocks with their lighthouses for a long time, as opposed to people who were maybe on the mainland and were still tied to this light because they were responsible for it, but they weren't as disconnected from society, I felt like, after reading this book. This book it provided the information that I was looking for my New England trip. However, so I do think it's useful for a visit. I think if you're visiting the region and you like lighthouses, this is definitely a book to look into. However, I think it might be even more useful if you live in the New England region and you enjoy visiting lighthouses, because I know that in my one trip, I'm not going to be able to look at every lighthouse in here. And there's a lot of interesting history and interesting stories behind each one of these lighthouses, and I want to see them all, and I just can't. This is not just a lighthouse tour. That's not just why I'm going to New England. I want to see a bunch of other historical sites, and I would like to do a lot of hiking. So I can't do it all. And I think that a book like this would be even more appreciated by someone who lives in that region. Where going to these lighthouses might just be an afternoon or a day trip, and not like me, where it's going to require some serious time and time off work to go to this area of the country and visit it. So I do feel like if you live in the region, this would definitely be something to maybe look into getting, or maybe a more recent copy if they do have one. I also find that along with the age, which I already mentioned, that the way that the age of the book plays into maybe the information or the usefulness of this book, there is a whole section about like visitor hours and stuff that I just totally skipped. That stuff is probably out of date. It's 20 years old. And if I'm going to visit a lighthouse, I'm just going to look online to see what the hours are. But I do appreciate, of course, that the authors included that in the book for people who are reading this in 2001, 2002. That would be helpful. I just, however, just skipped that because that wasn't going to be relevant to my trip. So that's just a little thing that also has become dated, but there's nothing the authors could do about it. So you really can't fault the authors because time passes. There's nothing they could do about the passage of time, and they included this information for people who got this book at that time. But overall, this book has held up very well over 20 years, and I did appreciate it. I also just want to credit the photographer, again, Susan Cole Kelly. I really liked her work in this book. So I'm just going to show some of my favorite photos. I really liked looking at the pictures, and there are a number of pictures in this book. I wrote down my page numbers. I really enjoy looking at pictures of lighthouses at like dawn or dusk or in the evening, and it's really interesting. Like when I go to see lighthouses, I try to arrange my trip so I can see it as like the sun is coming up or the sun is setting. I don't know why, I just really like the way they look at that time of day, so I feel like those were the pictures that I gravitated towards. Here's one. Is this daybreak? I'm not sure what this one is. We have another one on page 123. As you can see, I am drawn to the ones that are taken either early in the morning or late at night or later in the evening. Again, I don't know why. I don't know if I'm going to be able to see any of these lights at that time. I liked this one with the fog. I just feel like it evoked a really interesting mood that was kind of different. I think that the photographer really has a talent for capturing these lighthouses in a way that, I don't know. I don't know if I was taking these photos with my little iPhone on a trip, they're not going to look like this, is what I'm trying to say. And here's the final one. So definitely get this book out if you're interested in lighthouses, if you live in the New England region, if you're visiting the New England region, if you like history about lighthouses or boats or anything like that, this would probably be an interesting book for you. Don't be worried about the age of the book, the date of the book. The 20 years past doesn't age any of the information so severely that I thought this book wasn't really useful or that you definitely needed to get a more recent copy. And because it's 20 years old, you might be able to get a discount at like an online retailer or a used bookstore or something just because of the age of this book. Again, don't be dissuaded. It is perfectly is still informational, informative, and has all the information you need. I enjoyed it. I had a great time reading it. I really liked the photographer that provided the pictures. I liked her work. I think she has some work online, so I'll try to put her website in the description if I can find it, because I feel like she does really good work and I like the way that she captures it. And overall, I do recommend Lighthouses of New England, and I had a great time reading it. If you have any thoughts on this book, if you've read it, if you live in the area, if there's any other books on lighthouses that you think I should read, please let me know. I would love to hear it. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.